On November 14th, 2024, at exactly 9:47 in the morning, a black gubernatorial motorcade rolled up to the gates of Georgia Diagnostic Prison, carrying a signed clemency order for a man who had already stopped breathing exactly 7 minutes earlier. A corrections officer named Ray Torres walked out to meet them, his face carved from something harder than stone, and he said 4 words that would eventually make national headlines and haunt 3 people for the rest of their lives. "You are late by 7 minutes." Claire Danforth stood beside the black sedan, a manila folder pressed against her chest like a shield against everything crumbling inside her. The pardon was signed, the ink was fresh. The governor himself sat in the back seat. But none of it mattered anymore. To understand why the most powerful man in Georgia personally drove to a prison for a man nobody knew, and why those 7 minutes changed everything for 3 complete strangers, we need to rewind exactly 3 weeks backward. Back to a prison corridor that smelled like bleach, to a dying old man, and to a janitor who made one mistake. He stopped. He listened. And if you think you know where this story goes, I promise you, you do not. Because the truth buried inside this prison is darker and more heartbreaking than anything you have seen on this channel before. So subscribe now. Drop your guess in the comments about what that dying man whispered, and let us go back to where it all started. 3 weeks before that motorcade, at 5:11 in the morning, Marcus Delaney stepped onto a city bus in Savannah, wearing a gray jumpsuit that permanently smelled like industrial chlorine no matter how many times he washed the damn thing. He was 29 years old, thin as a wire fence, with a scar above his right eyebrow from a street fight he barely remembered, and a posture that screamed, "Please do not notice me," to anyone paying even the slightest bit of attention. He had a petty theft conviction that followed him like a shadow, closing every door before he could even knock on it properly. $9.50 an hour to mop floors in a maximum security prison was the best offer America had for him. He shared a room in a halfway house with a man who talked in his sleep about killing someone named Gerald every single night. His locker at work did not even have a lock because nobody figured a janitor owned anything worth stealing from him. Marcus had one rule that kept him alive and out of trouble for the 3 years since his release from county jail. Do not stand out. Do not get involved. Do not let anyone see you, because the moment the system notices you exist again. Georgia Diagnostic and Classification. And state prison sits in Jackson, Georgia, like a concrete scar on the red clay earth that stretches endlessly. Marcus knew every corridor, every drain, every flickering fluorescent tube that hummed a frequency only night shift workers ever learned. But there was one wing that felt different from every other block, a place where the air itself seemed to move slower. The hospice wing held men who were not serving sentences anymore because they were serving something closer to death warrants. The light there was dimmer, as if even the electricity understood that brightness would be cruel in a place like this one. Behind those walls, men coughed through the night like engines trying and failing to turn over one last, desperate time before dying. The smell was medical disinfectant layered over bleach, layered over something older and sweeter that Marcus tried never to name out loud. It was in this wing, in cell 47B, that Marcus first met a man named Elmer James Hutchins 3 years ago. Elmer was 74 years old and looked like the earth itself had tried to reclaim him slowly over nearly 4 decades. His wrinkles ran deep as cracks in drought-stricken soil, and his hands, at once powerful enough to lift engine blocks, now trembled constantly. He wore an oxygen mask that fogged with each shallow breath, and his voice came out as a rasp barely louder than paper. 38 years he had lived behind those bars, convicted of murder in 1986 in a trial that lasted less than 1 afternoon. His public defender had spent exactly 40 minutes on the case, No DNA evidence was presented. No witnesses were cross-examined properly at all. Elmer never filed an appeal, never wrote a complaint, never once asked for clemency or pardon or even a transfer to somewhere better. The other inmates called him Ghost because he moved through decades like a man who had already accepted that the world forgot him. But his eyes, Marcus noticed from the very first day he mopped that corridor, his eyes were completely and utterly unbroken by it all. Their ritual was nothing anyone would call friendship, but it was something quieter and perhaps more honest than friendship usually is. Marcus would push his mop past cell 47B, and sometimes Elmer would say a few words about the weather outside. Other times he would mention a book from the prison library, something about Marcus Aurelius or James Baldwin or the poetry of Langston Hughes. Some nights Elmer said nothing at all, and Marcus would just mop slower, letting the silence sit between them like a living thing. No one noticed these exchanges because no one noticed Marcus, and no one had noticed Elmer for approximately 38 years running now. Two invisible men sharing fragments of language in a corridor that smelled like chemicals and slow institutional decay was not newsworthy. But on the evening of October the 24th, 2024, something in Elmer's breathing changed in a way that Marcus felt. It was not louder or faster, but thinner, like a thread being pulled through a needle that was almost too small for it. Elmer's skeletal hand appeared through the bars, fingers curling inward, beckoning Marcus closer with an urgency he had never once shown before. Marcus leaned in, and the oxygen mask fogged twice before Elmer managed to push words through it like stones through wet sand. "Find the girl," he whispered. And his trembling hand produced a letter wrapped carefully inside a single torn page from Ecclesiastes. Not freedom, not a pardon, not a lawyer, not a phone call to a reporter, just find one girl and give her this letter before I die. The envelope was thin, almost weightless. But when Marcus took it, his fingers registered something heavier than paper should ever logically feel. Elmer's eyes locked onto his with a clarity that cut through the morphine and the cancer and the 38 years all at once. "This is the only thing I've ever asked for," he said, and his voice cracked on the word ever like old wood splitting. "In 38 years, Marcus, I never asked for nothing, not once. And now I am asking you for this one thing." Marcus stood there holding that envelope and understood with perfect, terrible clarity that he had a choice to make right now. He could slide it back through the bars and walk away, like he had walked away from everything his entire life before. But he did not slide it back through the bars, but he did not open it either. And that night, the letter sat in his unlocked locker, while Marcus lay on his halfway house bed, staring at water stains on the ceiling and listening to his roommate mumble about Gerald. Every rational thought told him to leave it alone, because this was not his story, and not his problem, and not his fight. He had spent 3 years building something that looked like stability, even if it was held together with bleach and bus schedules and silence. If anyone discovered that an inmate had passed contraband to a janitor, Marcus would lose his job in approximately 15 seconds flat today. And losing the job meant losing the room, and losing the room meant the street, and the street meant the system would swallow him again. His hands would not stop shaking, and then he realized it was not fear exactly, but something closer to recognition of a feeling he could not name. Something inside him understood that Elmer had looked past the gray jumpsuit and the mop and the criminal record and had seen a person standing there. By morning, riding the 5:15 bus back toward the prison, Marcus pulled the envelope from his jacket and read the name written on it. Claire Danforth, written in Elmer's shaking but deliberate handwriting, with each letter formed carefully like a man who knew these might be among the last words his hands would ever produce on this earth. Marcus pulled out his cracked phone, typed the name into Google with one thumb and watched the screen load over the bus's stuttering wireless connection. Where the first result was a photograph of a woman in a flawless charcoal suit standing beside Governor Richard Payne at a press conference about criminal justice reform. Claire Danforth, Chief of Staff to the Governor of Georgia, age 41, built her career from nothing after childhood tragedy and loss. Marcus stared at the screen and felt the bus seat vibrate beneath him as the distance between his world and hers became violently clear. A dying prisoner in a hospice wing who never asked for anything in 38 years was writing to the most connected woman in the state. And beneath her name on the envelope, in smaller letters, Elmer's trembling hand had added one single word that changed everything Marcus thought he understood. The word was sorry, and Marcus did not yet know why it was there. But he would. And when he did, nothing would be the same. Marcus spent the next 72 hours slamming into walls that were invisible, but harder than anything built from concrete or steel. He called the governor's office 14 times from a payphone outside the halfway house and reached a human voice exactly twice before disconnection. The first receptionist asked if he had an appointment and laughed when he said, "No, ma'am, I just need 10 minutes, please." The second one transferred him to a voicemail box that was full and had apparently been full since sometime around last spring, honestly. He tried writing a letter to Claire Danforth's office, but realized halfway through that a handwritten note from a janitor with a criminal record would land directly in the shredder bin. And on his one day off, he took 3 buses to the Georgia State Capitol building in Atlanta, wearing his cleanest shirt, which still carried ghost traces of chlorine embedded permanently in the fabric fibers. The security guard at the front entrance looked at his ID and said, "Sir, this building requires scheduled appointments, and I cannot let you pass this desk today." Marcus walked back to the bus stop and sat there for 40 minutes, watching people in suits flow through those glass doors like water through a gate that only opened for certain kinds of human beings in this country. Every closed door confirmed the thing Marcus had believed since he was 15 years old, sleeping behind a laundromat in Savannah with newspaper insulation. People like him were furniture at best and invisible at worst, and the distance between a prison janitor and a governor's chief of staff was not measured in miles, but in entire galaxies of privilege and access, and the assumption that your voice actually mattered to someone. He stopped trying after the 6th day, because his prepaid phone ran out of minutes and he could not afford more until Friday payday arrived. That evening, he dragged his mop down the hospice wing corridor slower than usual because his legs felt heavier than they should have at 29. The fluorescent lights buzzed their familiar dying frequency above him, and the smell of disinfectant mixed with something sweeter and more final than he wanted to acknowledge right now. When he reached cell 47B, he found Elmer propped up on 2 flat pillows, with the oxygen mask pulled aside and his eyes open and waiting. The old man's skin had gone gray in places it had been brown just days ago, and his breathing sounded like wind through a cracked window frame. But those eyes were still burning clear, and Marcus realized Elmer had been waiting specifically for him, because there was nobody else on this earth who would come. Marcus knelt beside the bars and told Elmer the truth plainly, because lying to a dying man felt like a sin worse than any crime he had ever actually committed in his life. "I cannot reach her, Elmer. She is surrounded by people whose entire job is making sure people like me never get within 100 feet of her office." Elmer nodded slowly, as though he had expected exactly this answer, and the disappointment barely flickered across his face before something deeper replaced it entirely. He began to speak in fragments, each sentence costing him visible effort, his chest rising and falling like a machine running on its last fumes of fuel. 1986, he whispered. Savannah, a house on Delancey Street, a fire that ate through the kitchen walls while a little girl screamed upstairs in the dark. I carried her out, Marcus. I carried her out through smoke so thick I could not see my own hands in front of my own face that night. She was 3 years old, and she weighed nothing, and she grabbed my neck so hard, her fingernails left marks that stayed for 2 full weeks afterward. But what happened before the fire and what happened after the fire are 2 different stories, and she has only ever heard the wrong one her whole life. Marcus pressed his forehead against the cold steel bars and felt the metal bite into his skin, while Elmer's words rearranged everything he thought this letter was actually about underneath it all. He wanted to ask 100 questions, but Elmer raised one trembling hand and said, "She has to read it herself, Marcus, because if I tell you everything now, you will try to explain it, and explanations from a third mouth always lose the thing that matters most, which is the truth of the person who lived through it." Then Elmer closed his eyes, and his breathing thinned again to that thread through a needle's sound that meant the conversation was over for tonight. Marcus stood up and gripped his mop handle and felt something shift between them that had no name in any language he knew how to speak fluently. This was not friendship, because friendship implies equality and leisure and choice, and none of those things existed inside these walls for either of them. This was something more desperate and more sacred. A dying man placing his only unfinished act into the hands of someone the world had trained to believe he was not capable of carrying anything that mattered at all. Marcus looked back once from the end of the corridor and saw Elmer's hand resting on the Bible page that had wrapped the letter. The old man's lips were moving silently, and Marcus could not tell if it was prayer or rehearsal for a conversation he would never get to have with Claire himself. The next evening, Marcus was mopping the same stretch of floor when a heavy boot stepped deliberately into his freshly cleaned path and stopped there like a period at the end of a sentence. Ray Torres stood 6'2" with a corrections officer badge that had worn smooth from 20 years of being clipped to the same belt every single morning. His face carried the permanent expression of a man who had seen too much institutional suffering to be surprised by anything, but not quite enough to stop caring entirely about the people trapped inside these walls. Torres looked down at Marcus, and then looked toward cell 47B, and then looked back at Marcus with eyes that performed a calculation faster than any computer ever built by human engineering. "You have been spending a lot of extra time near that cell lately, and I need you to understand that I notice things other guards do not bother noticing around here." Marcus felt his stomach drop, because this was exactly the moment he had feared since the night Elmer handed him that letter through the bars. He opened his mouth to deliver some excuse about a persistent stain on the concrete, but Torres cut him off with a slight shake of his massive head. "The old man does not have long, kid," Torres said quietly. And then he turned and walked away, leaving the door to the hospice wing corridor unlocked behind him, which it was never supposed to be after 8 p.m., according to official institutional protocol. Marcus stood frozen with the mop dripping onto the floor he had just cleaned, because he understood exactly what Torres had done, and what it meant, and what it cost a man with 20 years of service to look the other way, like that deliberately. Later that week, he learned why from a night nurse who talked too much during her smoke breaks outside the loading dock entrance every evening at 11:15 sharp. Torres had a father named Miguel, who died in a federal detention center in Texas in 2004 from a heart attack that went unnoticed for 6 hours because the overnight medical staff had been cut to save budget money that fiscal year. No one came to visit Miguel Torres in his final months, and no one claimed his body for 11 days, and Ray Torres drove 14 hours from Georgia to Texas to collect a cardboard box containing everything his father owned, which fit inside a single grocery bag easily. The nurse said Torres never talked about it, but every Christmas he put money on the commissary accounts of inmates in the hospice wing, who had 0 visitors listed in their files and 0 family contacts on record. "He helps because he knows the price of when nobody comes," the nurse said, exhaling smoke into the Georgia night air like a ghost escaping from her lungs. Now, Marcus realized then that this prison held more invisible people than he had ever imagined, and that invisibility was not always a weakness, because sometimes It was the only kind of power that the powerless actually possessed in a place designed to crush them. 2 days later, Marcus sat in the prison break room scrolling through old newspaper archives on his cracked phone during his 30-minute lunch that he always spent alone at the table nearest the emergency exit door. He typed Elmer Hutchins' 1986 Savannah murder into the search bar, and the results loaded slowly, like a curtain being pulled back on a stage that had been dark for nearly 4 decades of silence. The Savannah Morning News from October 9, 1986, carried the headline, "Local Man Convicted of Stabbing Death." And below it was a photograph of a younger Elmer being led from a courthouse in handcuffs, with his head down and his public defender already walking away toward the parking lot behind him. The victim's name hit Marcus like a fist directly to the center of his chest, because he had seen that surname before on an envelope sitting in his locker right now. Randy Danforth, age 31, found dead of a single stab wound in his home on Delancey Street, following a house fire that injured no one else, according to the official police report filed that night. Danforth, the article said, was survived by his wife Darlene and his 3-year-old daughter Claire, who were both present in the home at the time of the incident, but escaped physical harm. Marcus read that line 4 times, and each time the words rearranged themselves into something worse, because Claire Danforth was not just some woman Elmer wanted to apologize to before dying. She was the daughter of the man Elmer had been convicted of killing, and Marcus was carrying a letter from her father's murderer straight to her hands. His first instinct was to destroy the letter and pretend none of this had ever happened, because delivering a killer's last words to his victim's daughter was not mercy, but cruelty wrapped in a dying man's selfish need for absolution before meeting whatever came next after the last breath. He went back to cell 47B that night with the letter in his pocket and the intention to slide it back through those bars and say, "I am sorry, Elmer, but I cannot do this to her, and I will not do this to myself either." Elmer saw it in his face before Marcus even opened his mouth, because 38 years of reading people through steel bars teaches you to see what words have not yet formed on someone's tongue. The old man pulled his oxygen mask aside, and the effort of speaking was visible in every cord of his neck, straining against skin that had grown too thin to contain what was underneath. "I did not kill her father, Marcus," he said. And each word landed in the corridor like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples in every direction simultaneously. "But I know who did, and she needs to know the truth, because she has been hating the wrong person for 38 years of her life. And that kind of hate will eat her alive if nobody stops it." Marcus gripped the bars and stared into those unbroken eyes and felt the ground shift beneath everything he thought he understood about this story and this man and this letter. He did not give the letter back, and in that moment, standing in a corridor that smelled like bleach and ending, Marcus chose to believe a dying man over a 40-year-old newspaper headline, and that choice would cost him everything he had built and give him something he never knew he was missing. But he did not know that part yet. But 3 days of dead ends later, Marcus found his way to a woman named Patricia Okafor, who wrote for the Savannah Tribune and who had published a long-form piece about wrongful convictions in Georgia back in 2019 that mentioned Elmer's case in a single paragraph buried on page 11. Patricia was skeptical in the way that journalists who have been lied to by desperate people learn to be skeptical, which is to say, completely and without apology. But something in Marcus's voice when he described Elmer's eyes made her pause long enough to check her old notes and find a detail she had forgotten. She made one phone call and secured Marcus exactly 10 minutes with Claire Danforth at a public fundraiser for juvenile justice reform happening that Saturday evening at the Piedmont Park Conservancy in Atlanta. Marcus arrived wearing his only clean button-down shirt, which was too big in the shoulders and too short in the sleeves. And he stood among 300 people in tailored suits, feeling exactly like what he was, which was a man from a different universe entirely, who had somehow slipped through a crack in the wall, separating their world from his. Claire Danforth stood near the stage in a navy blazer with her hair pulled back tight and her posture radiating the kind of control that comes from spending decades making sure nothing and nobody ever caught her off guard or made her feel like that 3-year-old girl again. Marcus walked up to her and said, "Ma'am, my name is Marcus Delaney, and I work at Georgia Diagnostic Prison, and a man named Elmer Hutchins asked me to give you this before he dies." Claire's face did not move, but her eyes performed something violent and fast behind the mask, and she took the envelope and looked at the name written on it and said in a voice made entirely of ice, "If this is from him, I will burn it without reading a single word he wrote." Marcus should have walked away then, because the smart thing and the safe thing and the survivable thing was to say, "I tried, and leave this woman and her fury and her history alone forever." But Elmer had predicted this exact moment with the precision of a man who had spent 38 years thinking about nothing else in his cell every single night. "He told me you would say that, ma'am," Marcus said. "And he told me to ask you one question if you did say exactly those words to me tonight." Claire's jaw tightened and her hand holding the envelope trembled with a frequency so slight that only someone trained in invisibility like Marcus would ever notice it happening. "He said to ask you who carried you out of the fire that night on Delancey Street when you were 3 years old and could not save yourself." The color drained from Claire Danforth's face so fast that Marcus thought for one terrible second she might collapse right there on the manicured grass in front of 300 donors and a sitting governor. Security appeared at Marcus's elbow and a hand gripped his arm and steered him firmly toward the exit gate, while Claire stood motionless, holding the envelope like it contained a bomb, with a timer only she could hear ticking down. But she did not drop it, and she did not tear it. And as Marcus looked back over his shoulder while being escorted out, he saw her slide it into her blazer pocket with the careful, deliberate motion of someone who already knew that everything she believed about her own life was about to be incinerated by whatever was written inside those pages. And the question now was not whether she would read it, but whether she could survive what it said. Claire Danforth sat in her parked car outside the Piedmont Park Conservancy for 47 minutes before she touched the envelope again. Her fingers found the seal in the dark, and she tore it open with the precision of someone disarming an explosive device. Inside were 2 sheets of lined prison paper covered in handwriting that trembled but never wandered off. The ruled blue lines. There was also a photograph that slid into her lap face down like a card dealt by a dealer who already knew the game. She read the first line and her lungs stopped working because the words were not an apology but a confession of something else entirely. The letter began with the night of October 3rd, 1986. And it began not with a knife, but with a fire on Delancey Street. Elmer's voice lived inside that shaking script, and it pulled Claire backward through 38 years into a house she had spent her whole life trying to forget completely. But forgetting was over now, because the dead man in cell 47B was about to speak louder than he ever had while breathing. The letter described Savannah in October, when the air still carried summer heat and the cicadas screamed like sirens through the oak trees lining Delancey. Randy Danforth came home drunk at 11:14 that night, and Elmer heard the first crash through the thin shared wall between their houses clearly. Then came Darlene's scream, followed by the sound of a 3-year-old girl crying in a pitch that only terror can produce inside a child. Elmer described how he stood in his kitchen, listening to furniture breaking and glass shattering, while Randy's voice rose into something inhuman and unrecognizable. Then came the smell of smoke because Randy had swept the stove burners onto the kitchen floor, igniting curtains and cooking oil simultaneously. Elmer wrote that he did not think before running next door because thinking would have cost seconds that the fire would not give back. He found 3-year-old Claire in an upstairs hallway choking on smoke so thick his hands disappeared in front of his own face completely. He carried her out through a window and down a porch roof, and her fingernails dug into his neck, leaving marks that lasted 2 weeks. But here is the part that no courtroom ever heard, and no newspaper ever printed, and no detective ever bothered to investigate properly. While Elmer carried Claire out the front of the house, Darlene Hutchins was inside the kitchen facing her husband, who had just set their world ablaze. Randy came at her through the smoke with hands that had broken her ribs twice before and fractured her jaw once the previous winter season. Darlene grabbed the kitchen knife from the counter and swung once, because once was all a desperate woman needed to stop a monster permanently. Elmer came back inside after placing Claire on the grass and found Randy on the kitchen floor bleeding from a single wound. He pressed his hands against the wound, trying to stop what could not be stopped, because even monsters deserve someone trying to save them. The police arrived 4 minutes later and found exactly what 1986 Georgia was designed to find in situations like this one. A black man with bloody hands kneeling over a dead white man, while a terrified white woman stood silent, holding her daughter tightly. Darlene said nothing when the officers put Elmer in handcuffs, and she said nothing during the 40-minute trial that followed weeks later. Elmer wrote in the letter that he looked at Darlene holding 3-year-old Claire on the courthouse steps and made his decision in 3 seconds flat. If he told the truth, then Claire would grow up with a mother in prison instead of a mother who could raise her properly. If he told the truth, then a black man accusing a white woman of murder in 1986, Savannah would not be believed anyway. If he stayed silent, then 1 life ended behind bars, but 2 lives had a chance to become something worth the sacrifice. The letter contained 3 sentences that Claire read 7 times each, because each reading rearranged the architecture of everything she had ever believed. Your mama did what she had to do to protect you from a man who would have killed you both that night. I did what I had to do to protect her, because some promises do not need words to be made between 2 people. Do not hate either of us, because hate is a prison worse than any cell they ever put me inside of for 38 years. Claire turned the photograph over, and the breath left her body like something being pulled out by force against her own will. A young Elmer Hutchins held a 3-year-old girl against his chest beside a fire truck with red lights painting everything crimson and blue. The child's face was streaked with tears and soot, but her tiny hand gripped his collar with the desperate trust only a rescued child shows. On the back of the photograph, a paramedic named David Chen had written the date and signed his name as witness to the moment. This photograph had never appeared in any evidence file because no one thought to ask the paramedic what he saw that night in '86. Claire stared at the face of the man she had called monster for 38 years and saw only tenderness in his young eyes. Her reflection appeared ghost-like in the car window, superimposed over the photograph, creating an image of the woman she was and the child she had been. The carefully constructed narrative of overcoming tragedy that had built her entire career and identity cracked straight down the center like glass. She spent the next 48 hours in the Georgia State Archives, pulling every document connected to the case with hands that would not stop trembling. The fire department protocol confirmed a residential blaze at the Danforth home originating from the kitchen stove area, consistent with accelerant from cooking oil. Paramedic David Chen's original statement described an African-American male carrying a child from the burning structure before any emergency services arrived on scene. That statement had never been entered into evidence because the public defender never requested supplementary witness reports from the fire department at all. The police report listed Elmer's bloody hands as primary physical evidence, but never tested whose blood was on his palms or under his nails. No DNA analysis was conducted because in 1986, Savannah, a black man's bloody hands beside a white body, was considered evidence enough for conviction. Claire sat in the archive reading room, surrounded by yellowed papers, and understood that the system had not merely failed, but had never even attempted justice. 40 minutes of trial for 38 years of imprisonment, and the machine had not malfunctioned because it was working exactly as designed. Then came the detail that drove the knife deepest into the center of everything Claire thought she knew about her own mother. Darlene Hutchins never visited Elmer James Hutchins at Georgia Diagnostic Prison, and the visitor log confirmed 0 entries under her name from 1986 through 2004, when she died of pancreatic cancer in a Savannah hospice facility, 12 miles from the prison. 18 years of silence from the woman whose freedom Elmer purchased with his own life, spent inside a concrete box every single day. Claire imagined her mother carrying that secret like a tumor, growing larger each year, pressing against every organ of her conscience until it killed her. Darlene knew an innocent man sat in a cell because of her silence, and she chose her daughter's future over his every single morning. That choice was monstrous and merciful simultaneously, and Claire could not separate the two no matter how many times she tried to that night. She drove to the governor's mansion at 6:14 in the morning, carrying a manila folder thick with documents and a rage that had no single target. The woman who walked through those doors was not the controlled chief of staff anymore, but something rawer and more dangerous than any politician had ever seen. Governor Richard Payne sat behind his mahogany desk with a campaign schedule on his screen and a criminal justice reform slogan pinned to his bulletin board. Claire placed the folder in front of him and said, "Sign the clemency order, or I walk to the press room and tell every reporter what." Payne opened the folder expecting political theater, but found instead a 40-year-old photograph of a man holding a child outside a burning house. He read Elmer's 3 sentences, and Claire watched something behind his eyes shift like tectonic plates, moving beneath a surface that had been stable for decades. The governor, who had used reform as a billboard slogan, suddenly held an actual human life in his manicured hands, and the weight was different from anything politics. He signed the clemency order at 8:19 that morning and ordered his motorcade to Georgia Diagnostic Prison because for the first time in his career, the drive took 91 minutes, and during every single one of them, Elmer James Hutchins lay in cell 47B with his breathing growing. Ray Torres sat beside the bed, not because regulations required it, but because someone had to witness the last breaths of a good man. Marcus heard the code on the corridor radio at 9:32 and dropped his mop and ran toward the hospice wing faster than he had ever moved. The fluorescent lights blurred into streaks above him as his boots pounded concrete that he had cleaned 10,000 times before in 3 long years. He reached cell 47B and saw Torres standing with his hand still resting on Elmer's wrist, checking for a pulse already gone. Elmer's face held an expression Marcus had never seen on any living person, which was complete and absolute and unshakable peace at last. The oxygen mask sat silent beside him, and his hands lay still for the first time since Marcus had known him these past 3 years. At 9:47, the motorcade arrived, and Claire Danforth walked through the prison gates, carrying a signed pardon for a dead man 7 minutes late. Torres met her in the corridor and said the 4 words that had opened this story and now closed it with the weight of everything between. "And you are late by 7 minutes, and those 7 minutes contained 38 years of silence and sacrifice, and a love that never asked for anything back." Claire entered the room and stood over the body of Elmer James Hutchins, and the sound that came from her was not crying exactly. It was something older and deeper, like a wall that had held for 38 years, finally releasing every brick at once onto the floor. Beside his bed on the metal nightstand sat a second photograph that no one had seen before, and that Elmer had kept hidden for decades. Young Elmer and young Darlene standing outside a church in Savannah, laughing with their whole bodies, like people who believed the world was kind. On the back, in his careful, trembling handwriting, were the words that would haunt Claire for the rest of her natural life on Earth. "The only woman I ever loved, and the only decision I never regretted, no matter what it cost me in this life, I lived." Claire understood the final layer then because Elmer had not merely sacrificed himself out of nobility or neighborly duty or moral principle alone. He loved Darlene, and Darlene knew it, and she lived with that knowledge for 18 years and never once walked through those prison gates. Claire lowered herself to the floor beside his bed and pressed her back against the cold metal frame and held both photographs against her chest. Marcus stood in the doorway, watching a woman he had met once dissolve into someone entirely new and entirely broken and entirely free simultaneously. The governor stood behind Marcus in the corridor, holding a signed pardon that meant everything and nothing at exactly the same time in history. Torres closed his eyes and thought about his own father dying alone in a Texas detention center and understood why he had spent 20 years leaving doors unlocked. The silence in that room contained more truth than any courtroom in Georgia had ever held in its entire institutional existence since founding. 7 minutes was all that separated justice from tragedy, and in the end, the tragedy won, but only by 7 minutes and not by 38 years. Elmer James Hutchins died free in the only way that mattered, which was that someone finally knew the truth about what he did and why. The machine took 38 years from him, but it could not take the 3 seconds in which he chose love over self-preservation and meant it. 1 week later, Marcus Delaney arrived at Georgia Diagnostic Prison for his regular shift and found a sealed envelope taped to his locker in the break room. Inside was a handwritten letter from Claire Danforth and a certified check made out in his name for an amount that made his hands shake. The letter read, "Elmer told me you were the only person who saw him as a human being in 38 years of imprisonment. Now I see you too. And this check covers tuition and living expenses for law school. So do not dare refuse this gift from him." He would have wanted the man who carried his last words into the world to carry justice forward for others who cannot speak. Marcus stood alone in the empty corridor with fluorescent lights humming above, and the permanent smell of chlorine rising from his gray jumpsuit fabric. For the first time in 29 years, tears fell from his eyes and landed on the concrete floor he had mopped 10,000 times before today. He was no longer invisible because a dying man had seen him and a broken woman had heard him, and that was enough to change everything. Justice arrived 7 minutes late to Georgia Diagnostic Prison on November 14th, 2024, and that is an unforgivable fact that cannot be corrected. But justice arrived at all only because one janitor making $9.50 an hour stopped his mop outside cell 47B. He listened to a dying man whisper through an oxygen mask, and he chose to carry a letter across a distance the system designed to be uncrossable. Sir Elmer James Hutchins served 38 years for a crime committed by a woman he loved to protect a child he saved from fire. He never complained and never appealed and never asked for anything until the very end, when he asked for one impossible thing from one invisible man. Marcus Delaney delivered that impossible thing, and in doing so became visible for the first time in his entire life on this earth. Claire Danforth learned that the monster she hated for 38 years was the man who carried her from flames and chose prison over letting her grow up motherless. So the question this story leaves you with tonight is not whether the system failed, because we already know the answer to that one clearly. The question is simpler and harder, and it will follow you after you close this video and go back to your own ordinary life. If you were mopping that corridor and a dying man whispered through the bars, would you stop and would you listen and would you carry the letter? Or would you keep walking like the world taught you to, because staying invisible is safer than becoming the reason justice arrives at all? Think about that and then tell me your answer in the comments, because Elmer Hutchins waited 38 years for someone to stop walking past his cell, and the only person who did was a janitor that nobody in the entire world thought mattered, until he proved them all completely and absolutely and permanently wrong.